All right, so this is the engine out of my 98 12 valve. Had 350,000 miles on it. What I wanted to do was to go over the combination of parts that were in there with the factory engine. Ta-da! Show how this engine looks after 350,000 miles with over 100,000 of those at 600 horsepower or greater to the tire. So we're talking 700 plus flywheel power on this truck. First, let's start right here on the bottom end because we've got the block opened up here. Come in a little tight here on this center bearing here. If you look at these the bearing caps, there's no fretting or anything. That means the main caps haven't been walking. Normally, if the main caps are getting beat from the power of the torque, there'll be fretting and movement. There's none. So there's no girdle on this engine. It has 12 millimeter mains, so factory tiny 12 millimeter bolts, no problems. Bearings look beautiful. Honestly, if you were pulling this apart for like a junkyard dog build, you wouldn't even change these bearings. They look great, the top side here. Let's come over here on the bench now and let's look at the rest of the components out of this engine. I just want to show you guys the little wear items that you see in there, but really not that bad considering the mileage and the power level. All right, so I have main cap right here on the bench. Now, if you look at this, there's a tiny score in the bearing. That's it. It's not even showing any copper or anything. It is just simply little score. I mean, look at these little. So the older Cummins have 14 millimeter mains. This one has 12 because it's a 98. It's a storm block. So these tiny little main caps, no problem with inline 6 Cummins. But I just want you to see the bearings are fine running that big power. Now we do run good oil in this engine. We run the power driven oil, but still the first 150,000 miles, it just got junk Rotella or whatever was on the shelf. And it was at a lower power level, but I just want you to know, you don't have to go crazy building an engine to make 600 horsepower reliable. Looking here at the rods. You see still factory rod bolts. We've pulled the rods apart and checked. There's no fretting, so the caps weren't dancing on the rods. The pistons still look pretty good. There's a tiny bit of scuffing here. I've seen more wear than this on stock trucks, so this thing is doing just fine. The rings, I would say the tension is down. Definitely the rings are tired. You can tell they just don't quite have the spring to them, but they still do spring out. They're not like toast, but they definitely aren't like new rings that are there. The rod bearings, the only place we're seeing a little wear, we got a little bit of copper showing right here on the rod bearings. My junker drag truck, when I pulled apart, had way more copper showing this with only, I think it had 290,000 on it when I pulled it apart. So very minimal, wear. Really, honestly, these pistons are fine. There's no melting. Still read the part numbers on the top from Cummins. I mean, so the rods, pistons, just fine. Getting here a little deeper here, we got the camshaft here. Now the cam, when I'm looking at it, if we get in kind of tight here in the lobes, we can see there's a little bit of scuffing over the nose of some of the lobes. Now we're running a lot heavier valve spring in this than stock, so that's to be expected with a little tappet, but it's not bad, like it's gonna fail, but I wouldn't put this cam back in a new engine build if I was doing it. But I mean, it probably had another 50 or 100,000 miles left on it, but it's there. Something else a lot of guys are wondering, how do you get a stock engine to handle 700 horsepower? Well, a big problem is the cam gear tries to walk. So if you look here, you see these old welds I did? In frame, I welded this. So I pulled the front cover to address the killer dowel pin, and I welded the stock cam gear to the camshaft so it wouldn't walk. The reason I did that is when my junker drag truck hit about 650 horsepower, it walked the gear off. This caused a big oil leak, caused all kinds of problems. So lesson learned. So if you want to take your stock engine away, you can just weld this. Now, for the new engine build, we have a new aftermarket cam, bigger lift, bigger duration, a bolt-on cam retainer so the gear can't walk. But that's what you do on the stock setup. But I just want you to know the stock cam is fine for 700 horsepower. Would it make more with a bigger cam? Probably, but it worked. Let's look here at the rocker arms. These are just factory little rocker pedestals. There's nothing wrong. The arms are still free on it, as you can see. They move just fine. Sometimes if you get bad oil, these will gall. These are holding fine. You can see these are fly cut because I had head studs in there. So these have been off the truck before to be worked on, but like I said, these have over 100,000 miles at big power, big spring pressure. Nothing's worn out. They got a little wear on the tips where they run on the valves, but they're not done. I mean, this is just fine. There's better stuff out there, but I just want you to know, that 600 horsepower level, factory stuff works fine. So let's go over the turbo setup. A lot of you guys want to know, how do you make 600 plus horsepower on a stock truck? Compound turbos, absolutely. You can do it with a big single, but it's lazy, smoky, doesn't drive well. Compound turbos is where it's at. So this is Power Driven's towing compound turbo setup. It's a K27, and you can see this thing's been eating some oil. I mean, it's been on the truck for 100,000 miles almost. It is beat, it's been surged and barked, and it's got a little play in it. Like it definitely isn't happy at that 660 horsepower level. I mean, 100,000 miles still, that's not bad. This does have a 472 on it. We started with the 369 that comes in the kit, and as part of our R&D, we put a bigger turbo on there to see if it'd pick up power, and it didn't pick up any power. So, but we kept it on there because I was too lazy to swap. But normally this would be a little smaller 369. But we do have dyno data back and forth. In fact, the highest runs with this truck were with the 369 when it had the bigger fuel system. But still, it's within like 20 horsepower. So let's move along, check out the crankshaft here. This is the original crank out of the truck, 350,000 miles. The one thing I had trouble with on my junk or drag truck was the crank gear started shearing the crank pin on the end of the crank here, and it was messing with my injection timing a little bit and my cam timing. And so what I did is in frame, I TIG welded the gear onto here, but I sucked at TIG welding. There's actually some little like marks here from because I had a scratch start TIG. Anyway, long story short, you don't have to do that, but around that 700 horsepower level, you start having little issues with the crank gear trying to shear. When we build something for a customer, 750 horse or higher, we weld the crank gear so that it can't walk. But you can see I've just got a couple little rookie beads here, but the crank is fine. It's still straight. There's no scarring on the journals. When we look at the journals, I mean, like this rod journal looks perfectly polished. I mean, it's probably smoother than it comes from the machine shop after a performance polish job. But you got to realize, an oil bath bearing for that many miles, yeah, it's going to polish the crank. But really, there's nothing wrong with this truck. To kind of round out the setup, guys are wondering, I did have a built power-driven injection pump. So to get that power level, we did have a high-level 215 pump. Now, you don't need that much pump to get to this power level, but that's the pump I had on there. And that's why we think on the new engine build, we're gonna have a lot more power when we put bigger turbos on there. And we rounded it out with some, I think it had 5x16 injectors on the dyno run. This has had as small as a 5x11, all the way as big as a 5x20 in it, and everything in between testing. And with that big of an injection pump, the power only swings about 50 horsepower from the smallest size injector to the biggest. But that's because we're not really, we have so much pump, it can force a lot more fuel through those little injectors. Normally you wouldn't run a 5x11 for that power level. But I just kind of want to give you a quick rundown of my truck, this proven combination. And the reason I'm showing you this isn't a one-hit wonder, one dyno. I towed with this truck. I've hauled Todd's race truck all the way to Denver and back over the mountains. This is a proven setup making an honest 650 the tire for well over 100,000 miles. If you want like a basically maintenance-free hot rod 12 valve, 650 horsepower with some small like towing compound turbos is awesome. It runs good, it starts. This thing ran 25 degrees of timing. It would still start in the winter, still start in the summer. It's not like a crazy race truck. Now the truck is going to become more radical, cold-blooded. It's not going to want to start, but that's for the next video. For this video, I just want you guys to know this is a proven combination to get you to 650 horsepower to the tire.